March 6th is still 8 days away. Right now it is the night of February 26th, 1945, and the town of Elsdorf, Germany, is burning. Not all of it, just enough. A building somewhere down the street has caught, and the fire throws a long orange light across the rubble, across the shattered brick, across the road that leads into town. And sitting in that light, holding a roadblock, is an American tank that almost no one in the world has ever seen. It has a name painted on its hull, Fireball. Inside it are 5 men. In about 4 seconds, 2 of them will be dead. Neither of them will ever be named in the newsreel that made this tank famous. It is a T-26E3, 46 tons. A cast turret that sits heavy and low. A 90mm gun that stretches out over the front of the hull like something that does not belong on a tank at all. 2 weeks ago this machine was a rumor. Tonight it is parked in a German street, silhouetted against a fire it cannot move away from. Somewhere out in the dark, a tiger is watching it. Nobody in Fireball knows that. The crew is doing what tank crews do at night in a town that has not fully fallen yet. Watching the road, listening, waiting for morning, the tiger fires 3 times from about 100 yards. The first round goes in through the mantlet, through the small opening cut for the coaxial machine gun, the one gap in 4 inches of curved steel. It kills the gunner and the loader where they sit. The second round strikes the gun barrel itself. There is a shell already in the chamber. The impact sets it off. The barrel splits open from the inside. The third glances off the side of the turret and tears the commander's hatch away. 4 seconds, maybe 5. The first tank duel in history between a Pershing and a Tiger is over, and the Tiger has won it. This is not the story that gets told. The story that gets told happens 8 days later, in front of a cathedral, with a camera rolling. You have probably seen it. If your father came home from that war, he may have watched it in a theatre in 1945, the week it happened, and never once mentioned that he knew exactly what he was looking at. It is real, it is extraordinary, and by itself, it is a legend rather than a history. To understand why, we have to go back 7 months, to a summer that broke the American Armored Forces' confidence in its own equipment. Normandy, 1944. The American Army came ashore with the M4 Sherman, reliable, fast, easy to fix, easy to build, and built in numbers no German factory could match. It had been designed in 1941 against an enemy that no longer existed. Its 75mm gun had been perfectly adequate in 1942. Against the frontal armor of a Tiger, it was almost useless. The men who had to solve that problem in the field were young. Most of them had been civilians 2 years earlier. One of them was a 21-year-old corporal from Laheyton, Pennsylvania, named Clarence Smoyer. He had landed in France about 3 weeks after D-Day with the 3rd Armoured Division. He was a gunner, which meant he did not command anything, and he did not drive anything. He sat in the dark on the right side of the turret with his forehead pressed against a periscope sight, and his entire job came down to a single question, asked over and over across France and Belgium and Germany. Who shoots first? He had a rule about it. Shoot fast and shoot straight. That was not bravado. That was arithmetic. If a Sherman crew met a German heavy tank at range and the German fired first, the Sherman crew usually did not get a second chance. So the American answer had to be the first round, at close range, into a flank, into a track, into anything that was not that beautiful sloped front plate. His tank commander was a sergeant named Robert Early. Bob Early was 29 years old, a farmer from Fountain, Minnesota, and in a division full of 20-year-olds that made him practically ancient. The crew had been together since September of 1944. Early was the kind of commander who would get out of his tank, on foot, in a contested city, to go look at something with his own eyes rather than trust what he could see through a periscope. That habit is going to matter enormously in 8 days. Now cross the line. In northern Germany, there was a farm boy named Gustav Schäfer. He was 18 years old. His father had already been taken by the army, which left the family short-handed on the land. And then they came for Gustav too. He became a gunner, the same job Smoyer had, the same seat, the same periscope, the same question, who shoots first? He would end up in Panzer Brigade 106, in a Panzer IV sent with a handful of tanks against an American army. 2 boys with the same job on opposite sides of the same street. Neither of them chose any of it. Hold on to both of them. They are going to meet twice, once through a gun sight and once, 68 years later, on the steps of a cathedral. Now, the gun. Because here is where the popular version of this story goes wrong, and the truth is more interesting than the myth. The claim you have heard is that German tank crews had no idea the Americans had built a 90mm gun capable of killing a Tiger, that the Pershing came out of nowhere, that its gun was a secret weapon. It was not a secret, and it was not new. The gun was the M3. It was adapted from an American anti-aircraft gun. It fired a standard armor-piercing capped round at roughly 2,650 feet per second, and it could do something no Sherman gun could do, which was punch through the front of a Tiger at ordinary battlefield ranges. And the Germans had been on the receiving end of it since September 1944, because the same gun, the identical weapon, was already mounted on the M26 tank destroyer. The M36 reached Europe in the autumn of 1944. It was the most lethal American armored vehicle in the theater. It was the one thing in the American inventory that could kill a Panther or a Tiger from the front at distance, and German crews had been meeting it for 5 months before a single Pershing fired a shot. So when a German tank crew in February of 1945 was hit by a 90mm round, that was not a revelation. That was Tuesday. What was new was not the gun. It was what the gun was bolted to. For 5 months, a 90mm shell had meant an M36. Open-topped, thin-skinned, a hunter that could kill you but could not survive being found. You could break an M36 with a mortar round, with a machine gun burst that came in over the turret wall, with almost anything. What arrived in February was that same gun inside 4 inches of sloped, cast frontal armor on a 46-ton hull with a roof over the crew. The gun was familiar, the thing carrying it was not. That is the real story, and it raises the question nobody in the popular version ever asks. If the Americans already had the gun in the autumn of 1944, why did it take until the last 10 weeks of the war to put it into a tank? The answer is not German intelligence. The answer is not secrecy. The answer is that the United States Army spent 2 years arguing with itself. American armored doctrine had settled on a division of labor. Tanks were for exploiting breakthroughs and fighting infantry. Enemy tanks were the responsibility of a separate branch, the tank destroyers, in fast, lightly armored vehicles that would be massed to meet an armored attack. On paper it was elegant. It meant you did not need to build a heavy tank at all. Standing behind that doctrine was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the commander of Army Ground Forces, the man who shaped how the American Army was organized, equipped, and trained. McNair was not a fool, and he was not a villain. He was a careful, austere officer who believed that shipping space was finite, that reliability beat armor, and that a heavier tank the troops did not need was a heavier tank that would break down and clog roads. So the heavy tank program was slowed. Requests were questioned. The T-26, the design that would become the Pershing, moved forward at the pace of a peacetime committee while a war was on. Historians still argue about how much of that delay belongs to him. What is not argued is that the argument itself cost 2 years. Then came Normandy and hedgerows and tigers, and the doctrine failed in front of everyone. McNair did not live to see it settled. On July 25, 1944, he was in a forward position watching the opening of Operation Cobra when American heavy bombers dropped short onto their own lines. He was killed there, in a foxhole in France. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European campaign, and he was killed by his own Air Force. The men who kept fighting through that summer had no idea any of this had happened. They only knew what the result felt like from the inside of a Sherman. Production of the new tank finally began at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, in November of 1944. 10 tanks that month, 30 in December, 70 in January, 2.5 years of argument, and now the war had about 6 months left to run. Which brings us to the third thing that gets left out. In January of 1945, 20 of these tanks were shipped to Europe. Not 100, not 1,000. 20 they came with a man. Major General Gladzion M. Barnes was 57 years old, and he was the chief of the Research and Development Section of Army Ordnance. He was, in the plainest terms, the man responsible for the tank, and he personally crossed the Atlantic with it, leading a team the Army called the Zebra Mission, carrying other experimental weapons along with the tanks. Understand what that means. A general officer does not accompany a finished product to the front. He accompanies an unfinished one. The T-26E3 still had problems. The transmission was not fully proven. The whole design had gone from drawing to production faster than any American tank of the war, and the shortcuts had not all been found yet. So the Ordnance Department sent its own engineers to the front line, to stand next to the tanks while they fought, and to find out what broke. The 20 tanks reached Antwerp and were split down the middle. 10 went to the 3rd Armoured Division, 5 each to its 32nd and 33rd Armoured Regiments. 10 went to the 9th Armoured Division. Crews were trained near Aachen. By late February they were ready. The 3rd Armoured Division was commanded by Major General Maurice Rose, the son of a rabbi, a man who led from so far forward that his own staff could rarely find him. 10 tanks in a division of hundreds, 1 per company, and the men chosen to crew them understood exactly what that meant. They were not being given a war-winning weapon. They were being handed a prototype and told to go first. On February 25, 1945, the 3rd Armoured Division took them into action for the first time near the Roer River. The next night, one of them was sitting in a burning street in Elsdorf, holding a roadblock lit up against a fire it could not move away from, while a Tiger crew watched it through a gun sight from 100 yards. Fireball belonged to F Company of the 33rd Armoured Regiment, and what happened to that tank, and what happened to the Tiger that killed it, would decide everything that came after. The men outside heard the 3 shots as one sound. Inside, there was no sound at all in the way we normally mean it. There was pressure, arriving through 4 inches of steel, a wall of it that hit the chest before the ears. Then heat, where there had been none. Then the smell, which every tanker who lived through a penetrations described the same way, and none of them ever forgot. Hot metal, scorched paint, and underneath it something worse. 2 men in that turret were dead before the second round landed. They had been sitting where Clarence Smoyer sat in another tank, in another company. Same seats, same job. In an armoured division, the difference between the men who come home and the men who do not is very often nothing but which street you were parked on. Then it stopped. The tank did not burn. That is worth pausing on, because it is the first small piece of evidence in a story that is mostly about big claims. The Pershing took 3 hits from the most feared tank gun of the war at point-blank range, and it did not brew up. 2 men died. 3 men walked away. Now watch what happened to the winner. The Tiger had done everything right. It had waited. It had let the American tank silhouette itself. It had fired first, and hit the exact place worth hitting. They are the only Tiger crew in the war who fought a Pershing and won. Nobody ever took that away from them. And then they tried to leave. The Tiger backed up. In a German town in 1945, backing up meant reversing into a street that had already been fought through, a street full of collapsed masonry and roof timbers and the broken furniture of other people's lives. The tank went into the rubble, and it hung there, 63 tons of it, tracks turning against nothing. The crew got out and walked away from it. Think about what that means. Both tanks were disabled in the same engagement. One of them was recovered, repaired, and returned to the war. The other was left where it stood, because there was nothing left in Germany to pull it out. By the winter of 1945, the Reich could still build magnificent machines. It could no longer afford to lose them, and it could no longer get them back. That is not a story about armour thickness. That is a story about an army running out of everything except courage. There is one more detail here, and it deserves care, because this is where a lot of retellings start inventing things. Several accounts identify the Tiger that killed Fireball as vehicle number 201 of a heavy tank battalion designated 301, a unit built around radio-controlled demolition vehicles. That may well be right. It appears in serious secondary work. But it is not something you will find nailed down in an American after-action report. And the honest thing to say is that the identification comes from later research rather than from a document written that night. The men in Fireball never knew who killed them. They only knew what it felt like. And here is the part that should have ended the American experiment before it started. The first Pershing to fight a Tiger lost. Not narrowly, not through bad luck alone. It lost because the Germans held the ground, chose the moment, and knew the weak spot. Everything the Pershing was supposed to fix It did not fix, because the oldest rule of tank fighting had not changed and was never going to change. The tank that shoots first usually wins. The armor only decides how much time you have to be wrong. The next day, the Americans got their turn. The fight for Elsdorf went on, and a second T-26E3 from the 3rd Armored Division found itself facing German armor in daylight. This time the Americans saw first, at about 900 yards, that Pershing killed a Tiger I, then it killed 2 Panzer IVs. 900 yards. For a Sherman crew, that number was a fantasy. For a Sherman crew, 900 yards from a Tiger was not a firing position, it was a place where you died tired. The photographs of that Tiger, published years later by the historian, who did more than anyone to document these vehicles, show where the round went in. Low, through the gun shield. That is the moment the Pershing earned its reputation. 1 tank, 3 kills, at a range where American tankers had spent 8 months being slaughtered. And now the part that almost never gets said out loud. That Tiger was not killed by the tank. It was killed by the ammunition. The round that did it was a T-30E16, HVAP, hypervelocity armor piercing. Inside the shell casing was a sub-caliber core of tungsten carbide, one of the hardest usable substances available to any nation on Earth, wrapped in a lightweight body so it could be driven out of the barrel far faster than a standard shot. It was, in the simplest terms, the best anti-tank round the American Army had, and there was almost none of it. Tungsten was a strategic metal. It was needed for machine tools, for cutting the dies and bits that made everything else in the war economy. Every pound of tungsten fired down a gun barrel in Germany was a pound not turning in a lathe in Ohio. So HVAP was rationed. Crews got a handful of rounds, not a load, a handful. Men who fought the 76mm Sherman told the same story after the war. They would carry 2 or 3 of the special rounds if they could get them, hoard them the way a man hoards the last dry matches, and hope that when the moment came the round they needed was on top of the stack and not buried under high explosive. So consider what the Elsdorf victory actually proves. It proves that a well-handled American tank, firing scarce ammunition it could not count on having, at a target it saw first, could kill a Tiger at 900 yards. Every one of those conditions had to be true. Change any of them, and you get Fireball, lit up in a burning street, with 2 men dead in the turret. That is the honest ledger of the Pershing's first 48 hours in the war. 1 loss, 1 triple kill. And a lesson that had nothing to do with the myth. The tank did not make men safe. It gave good crews a chance they had not had before. Now what happened to Fireball is the detail that quietly demolishes the legend, and almost nobody tells it. They fixed it. The tank that had been hit 3 times by an 88, with a split barrel and a hole through its mantlet, and 2 dead men in its turret, was hauled back, worked on, and put back into the war by the 7th of March. 9 days. 9 days from wreck to fighting, but before that date arrived, this division had a city to take. And somewhere in that repair, Fireball needed a gun. According to research done in the Ordnance records, the barrel that went onto it was taken from an M26 tank destroyer. Sit with that. The famous secret weapon, the tank whose 90mm gun supposedly stunned the German army, went back to war wearing a gun pulled off a vehicle that had been shooting at those same Germans since the previous September. The gun was never the secret. It was in the parts bin. That is the sentence the legend cannot survive. The men who did that work were not glamorous, and they did not get filmed. They were the maintenance and ordnance troops of the armoured divisions, the ones who went out at night to recover what was left, who cut, welded, hoisted, and scavenged, and put men back into machines that had killed their friends. One of them, a young ordnance lieutenant in the 3rd Armoured Division's Maintenance Battalion named Belton Cooper, would write a memoir about it decades later. Historians argue about that book, and they are right too. Cooper got things wrong, but he saw with his own eyes the part that is not in dispute. The 3rd Armoured Division crossed Europe by feeding tanks into a fire and dragging them back out again, night after night, and by putting new 19-year-olds into the seats where the last ones had died. The crews did their own engineering too. Somewhere in that division, someone decided 4 inches of steel was not enough, and at least one Pershing had concrete poured and reinforced onto its frontal armour. Concrete. On a brand new tank the Ordnance Department had just spent 2.5 years fighting to build. That is what the men at the front thought of the armour they had been given. Barnes and his ordnance team were there for exactly this. That was the point of sending a general to the front with a prototype. Find out what breaks. Find out what the men add. Find out what the enemy aims at. They found out on the first night. Now the story moves to a city, and the shape of the war changes with it. On March 5, 1945, the American First Army entered Cologne. Cologne was one of the largest cities in Germany, and by 1945 it barely existed. It had been bombed for years. In May of 1942, it had been the target of the first 1,000 bomber raid of the war. By the time American tanks rolled in, most of the population had gone, and what was left was a landscape of standing walls and open cellars and streets that were more debris than street. And above all of it, impossibly, the cathedral. The Cologne Cathedral had been hit repeatedly. It was scarred, holed, patched. And it was still standing, 2 black spires over a city that had been erased around them, visible from miles out. For the men coming in, it was the landmark that told you where you were. For the men defending, it was the last thing worth standing in front of. Urban armoured fighting is a specific kind of horror, and it explains everything that follows. In open country, a tank crew fights with distance and optics. In a city, distance disappears. Sight lines are measured in blocks. A tank can be 20 yards away and completely invisible behind a corner. Every intersection is a place where 2 guns might meet at ranges where nobody's armour matters. You cannot manoeuvre. You cannot flank across open ground. You go up a street, and the enemy has already chosen which street he is aiming down. The Germans defending Cologne had almost nothing left. Panzer Brigade 106 had a handful of tanks. They were not going to hold the city, and everyone involved understood that. They were there to make the Americans pay for it by the block. Among them, in a Panzer IV, was the 18-year-old farm boy from northern Germany, Gustav Schäfer, and coming into that same city with the 3rd Armoured Division was Clarence Smoyer in a Pershing marked E7. Eagle 7. The crew had been together since September. Sergeant Robert Early in the commander's hatch, 29 years old, the farmer from Minnesota. Smoyer in the gunner's seat, 21. John DeRiggi loading, from Scranton, Pennsylvania, wearing a French tanker's helmet he had traded for somewhere along the way, which made him one of the most recognizable men in the division. William McVie driving. Homer Davis, called Smokey, in the bow, in a knitted hood you can pick out on film 80 years later. 5 men who had crossed France and Belgium together and were now driving into one of the largest urban battles the Americans fought in Europe. They had been given the newest tank in the American arsenal, which meant, as it always does, that they were expected to go first. Mid-afternoon on March 6th, Eagle 7 was pushing toward the cathedral when something happened at an intersection that would follow Clarence Smoyer for the rest of his life. A civilian car came into the street. Nobody has ever been able to fully explain it. A car moving in the middle of an active tank battle in a dead city. A German Panzer IV opened fire on it. Smoyer saw the tracer. German tracer burned a different colour than American tracer, and to a gunner that was information. That was a direction. That was an enemy tank telling you where it lived. He fired too. The driver of the car was killed. Beside him was a 26-year-old woman named Katharina Esser. Kathy. American medics reached her. There is a photograph. 3 of them working over her in the open street, while a Sherman and Eagle 7 sit a few yards away covering them. She died there, in the road, in her own city, in a war that was 9 weeks from ending. Smoyer worked out roughly where the German fire had come from, judging by the angle, and put rounds into the building the tank was hiding behind. The masonry came down on top of the Panzer IV. Its crew climbed out and surrendered. The gunner was 18 years old, and his name was Gustav Schäfer. 2 gunners, both of them fired at that car. Neither of them knew, and neither of them would know for 68 years, which rounds had done what. What Clarence Smoyer carried out of that intersection, he carried alone, for the rest of his life. But the afternoon of March 6th was not finished, and there was another tank in Cologne, and it was already waiting. Near the cathedral, a Panther had positioned itself in a railway station underpass. Under cover, out of the light, looking down a street. It was commanded by a lieutenant named Wilhelm Bartelborth. The Panther was, by many measures, among the finest tanks of the war. Sloped frontal armour, A long 75mm gun with a flat trajectory and superb optics. In a defensive position in a city, it was as close to a perfect ambush weapon as existed on that battlefield. And it was invisible. 2 Shermans came up that street. Neither of them could see it. The lead Sherman was commanded by a 26-year-old second lieutenant named Karl Kellner. Kellner was from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, born in November of 1918, the eldest son in a family with 2 sisters and a younger brother. He had a fiancée back home in Wisconsin named Cecilia Barth. He had already been awarded the Silver Star, and 2 weeks earlier, he had been given a battlefield commission. That phrase deserves explaining, because a lot of people hear it and do not know what it costs. A battlefield commission means you did not go to West Point, and you did not go to officer school. It means you were an enlisted man, and you did something in combat so far beyond your rank that the army made you an officer on the spot, in the field, because there was no honest alternative. Karl Kellner had earned that. 14 days before Cologne, the Panther fired once. The round went into Kellner's Sherman. Men died inside it. And Kellner, the new lieutenant, the man who had been an enlisted soldier a fortnight earlier, came out of that tank with his leg gone below the knee. He jumped down. He landed on the leg he still had. Running toward him across that street was a 26-year-old sergeant from Albany, New York, a reporter for the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes. His name was Andy Rooney. Half a century later, he would be one of the most recognizable voices in America, closing out 60 Minutes on Sunday nights in millions of living rooms, including, very likely, yours. On March 6, 1945, he was a young man sprinting into a street where a tank had just been killed. He and another soldier moved Kellner clear of the burning Sherman. They tried to stop the bleeding. It could not be stopped. Andy Rooney held Karl Kellner in his arms while he died. Rooney wrote and broadcast for 50 more years. He never once wrote about that war as an adventure. He had held a 26-year-old from Wisconsin in a street in Cologne, a man who had been an officer for 2 weeks, and he knew exactly what it cost. Accounts differ on exactly how many men died in that Sherman. Some sources say 2 crewmen plus Kellner. Some say 3 killed in total, including him. The records from that afternoon are not clean, and anyone who tells you they are is telling you something they cannot support. What is not in dispute is that a lieutenant with a fiancée in Wisconsin bled to death in the arms of a newspaperman, in a street he had never seen before, in front of a cathedral that had somehow survived everything, and that the Panther that killed him was still there, still in the underpass, still hidden, still aimed down that street, waiting for the next American tank to come up it. Word went back through the column. There was a heavy tank in front of the cathedral. It had already killed a Sherman. Nobody could see it. There was one tank in that part of the city with a gun that could deal with it. Eagle 7 was 1 street over. They were called for. Now Bob Early did the thing that defined him. He did not roll his tank into an intersection to find out what was on the other side. He got out and went on foot. He walked into a building near the intersection and climbed it, floor by floor, in a contested city, alone except for a Signal Corps cameraman who had attached himself to the 3rd Armored Division, a technical sergeant from the 165th Signal Photographic Company named Jim Bates. Early found what he was looking for. From up there he could see the Panther in its underpass, and he could see its gun, and its gun was pointed the wrong way. It was still covering the street where Kellner had died, which meant there was a plan. Bring Eagle 7 up the parallel street, ease into the intersection, and put a 90mm round into the side of a Panther that was looking somewhere else. Early told Bates to stay where he was, because Eagle 7 would be coming right past that building. Bates went higher instead, for a better angle. That decision, made by one cameraman in one stairwell in one ruined city, is the reason you can watch what happened next. It is one of the very few tank duels of the war filmed from start to finish. Early climbed back down and got into his tank. And while he was walking back, 3 or 4 minutes of an ordinary man crossing rubble, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth gave an order inside the Panther. Traverse right. The gun came around, slow and heavy, off the street where Kellner's Sherman was still burning, and settled on the intersection where an American tank would have to appear if it wanted to shoot him in the flank. Bob Early did not know. Clarence Smoyer did not know. They were about to drive into an intersection with a plan that had already stopped being true. Early climbed into the turret and gave the order to move. Inside Eagle 7, the plan was simple, and every man had it. Come up the parallel street, nose into the intersection, far enough to see the Panther's flank, not 1 yard further. Smoyer had permission to fire whenever it felt right. Early had given him that already. There would be no time for a command. The Pershing came around the corner, and William McVeigh, down in the driver's seat, had his periscope turned toward the Panther. He saw the gun, not the side of the tank, not the engine deck, the muzzle, coming around to meet them. In the turret, Smoyer's periscope filled with the same thing. He had expected the length of a Panther, broadside, helpless. Instead, he was looking straight down the barrel of a 75mm gun, at a range where nothing on earth would have saved them. Everything they had planned was already gone. The reconnaissance was 3 minutes old, and 3 minutes was the whole war. He fired. There was no aiming in the way we imagine aiming. There was a shape and a decision, and a foot on a trigger. He snapped it off and he hit. Then he fired again. Then he fired a third time. He said later, in the plainest words a man can use, that he wanted that tank to burn. And it did. 80 years on, people ask why 3 rounds? Why keep shooting at a tank that is already finished? Because Clarence Smoyer had spent 8 months learning what a wounded enemy can still do with 1 last breath and 1 loaded gun. Because a Panther that is not burning is a Panther that might still turn. Because minutes earlier, a Sherman had come up the next street over, and a lieutenant from Wisconsin had come out of it with his leg gone. You do not stop shooting until it is over. That was the lesson. It had been paid for. The Panther's crew came out. Bartleborth himself can be seen on the film, climbing clear of his tank immediately after the first round struck. Some of his men got out. Some of them did not. The whole engagement lasted less than a minute, and high in a building above the intersection, Jim Bates had all of it. The Pershing coming up, the rounds going out, the German tank catching fire in front of the cathedral. That footage went home. It played in newsreels, in theaters, across the United States, in towns where men from that division had grown up, in front of families who had no idea whether their own boys were alive that week. America watched an American tank kill a German tank in front of a cathedral, and it looked like the war being won. What the newsreel did not show was the intersection a few blocks back, where a young woman had died in a car that afternoon. What it did not show was the plan that had failed, or the 3 minutes that had turned a flank shot into a coin flip. What it did not show was that this was not a demonstration of superior American armor. It was a gunner who was half a second faster than the other gunner. That is the truth of the most famous tank duel of the war, not steel, reflex. The day after Cologne, something happened about 30 miles south that mattered far more to the outcome of the war, and almost nobody remembers a tank was involved. On March 7th, 1945, elements of the 9th Armored Division came over a rise and saw something no American planner had allowed themselves to expect. The Ludendorff railway bridge at Remagen was still standing across the Rhine. The Germans had been demolishing every bridge on that river for weeks. This one had charges on it. They had every intention of blowing it. The Americans went for it. Infantry crossed under fire, while engineers cut wires and threw explosives into the water. Charges went off, and the bridge lifted and settled and stayed up. Behind them, firing into the towers on the far bank, were Pershings. The 9th Armored Division had received 10 of the 20 tanks sent to Europe, and some of them were at Remagen that day, putting 90mm rounds across the Rhine. That was the Pershing's real contribution to the war. Not a duel, a bridge. Remagen did not end the war. It ended Germany's last chance to fight it on their own terms. Men on foot won that crossing, but the tanks were there, and their guns reached the far bank, and by nightfall the Allies had a bridgehead on the eastern side of the Rhine that Germany could not close. 3 weeks later, the arithmetic caught up with the man who had brought the Pershings to the front. On March 30th, 1945, Major General Maurice Rose was moving forward near Paderborn, the way he always moved forward, ahead of his own headquarters, closer to the fighting than a division commander had any business being. His small column ran into German armor in the dark. Rose was killed there. There has been argument about the circumstances ever since. Some accounts say he was shot while reaching to unbuckle his sidearm, and a young German tank commander read the motion as a draw. Others dispute the details. The honest position, 80 years on, is that the exact sequence is still contested and no one alive can settle it. What is certain is this: the son of a rabbi, the highest-ranking American Jewish officer of the war, the man who commanded the division that carried the first Pershings into combat, died on a German road with 5 weeks left in Europe. He had 10 of the best tanks America ever built. It did not matter. He was killed the way most men were killed in that war, in the wrong place at the wrong minute, and no armor in the world was going to be there. So what did the Pershing actually do? Here are the numbers, and they are not the numbers the legend wants. 310 Pershings reached Europe before Germany surrendered. About 200 of those were issued to combat units. The last 100 sat in depots, and of the entire fleet only about 20 ever fought, 20 tanks, in an American army that had thousands of Shermans in the field, in a theatre with millions of men. 20. They did not break the German army. Anyone who tells you that the appearance of the Pershing shattered German morale, that Tiger crews refused to fight, that the Panzer divisions collapsed because of a rumor about an American heavy tank, is selling you a story. The German armored force in the West collapsed for reasons you can count. It had no fuel, it had lost the sky, so it could not move in daylight. It had no trained replacements for the crews it had already burned through. It was building magnificent tanks it could not recover, could not fuel, and could not crew. The Tiger at Elsdorf proves it perfectly. That crew won their fight. Then they backed into rubble and walked away from 63 tons of the finest armor in the world, because there was nothing left to pull it out. That is what defeat looked like. Not fear of an American gun, abandonment, and the Pershing itself was not a super tank. It was a good tank, arriving late. Its transmission was underdeveloped. It was heavy for its engine. Its mantlet had a hole in it that a good gunner could find at 100 yards, and one did on the very first night. What the Pershing gave the American tanker was not invincibility. For the first time, an American crew meeting a German heavy tank head-on was in a fight instead of an execution. Not a guarantee, a chance. Fireball proved how thin that chance still was. 20 tanks got that much. Everyone else finished the war the hard way. Now come forward. Clarence Smoyer went home in August of 1945. He married. He had 3 children. He worked in an industrial plant in Pennsylvania and lived quietly in Allentown, and for most of his life the people around him did not know that the young man in the newsreel their parents had watched was him. He destroyed 5 German tanks in less than a year of combat. That is an extraordinary number for one gunner. It was not what stayed with him. What stayed with him was a car in an intersection in Cologne and a woman he never met. For decades, he did not know her name. He did not know whether his rounds or the Germans' rounds had killed her. He did not know if there was anyone left to ask. In 2012, a writer named Adam Makos found him. In 2013, they went back to Germany. They found the German gunner, the farm boy from the north, now an old man, who had fired at the same car on the same afternoon in 1945. Gustav Schaefer. The two of them met on the steps of Cologne Cathedral, the same stones. Smoyer put his hand out. He said the war was over, and they could be friends. Schaefer said yes. They found members of Katharina Esser's family. Those people, who had every reason on earth to hold on to it, told 2 old men that they did not blame either of them. They blamed the man who started it. The 2 former enemies went together to the mass grave in Cologne, where Kathy Esser is buried with the other civilians killed in that battle, and they laid yellow roses on it. As Clarence Smoyer knelt to put his rose down, he lost his balance. Gustav Schaefer caught him. The German gunner, who had once tried to kill him, reached out and held him up so he would not fall on the grave of the woman they had killed together. 68 years, and it came down to one old man steadying another. They stayed in touch, Christmas cards, letters. Schaefer died in 2017 at 90. In 2019, in a surprise ceremony, the United States Army awarded the crew of Eagle 7 the Bronze Star. Clarence Smoyer, then 95, was the only one alive to accept it in person. Robert Early, John DeRiggi, William McVeigh, and Homer Davis received theirs after death. Early had already been given one for Cologne, long before, 74 years late, but it came. So the title of this story says, German tankers never knew the Americans had a 90mm gun that could kill their Tigers. They knew. They had been fighting that gun since September of 1944 on M26 tank destroyers, and the barrel that went back onto Fireball after the Germans wrecked, it was pulled off one of those very vehicles. There was never a secret weapon. There was a gun the Americans already owned, finally bolted to something that could survive being shot at. What the men in this story actually did not know is much simpler and much harder. Karl Kellner did not know he had 2 weeks as an officer. Katharina Esser did not know why she was in that street. Clarence Smoyer did not know that the worst thing he would carry out of the war would not be a tank he destroyed. Maurice Rose did not know that a road near Paderborn was the end of it. And 2 gunners, 18 and 21 years old, sitting in the dark behind 2 periscopes on the same afternoon, did not know they would shake hands as old men on the steps of a cathedral that had outlived all of it. The tank was never the story. The tank was just the thing they were sitting in.